December 4th, 1962, 3:17 p.m. Mamie Johnson walks out of the Harlem Market on 125th Street. She's carrying 2 bags of groceries. The air is cold. She's thinking about dinner, about Bumpy, about the normal life she's carved out in the middle of his empire. She doesn't see the black sedan idling half a block down. She doesn't see the 2 men in dark coats get out. They move with a purpose that isn't theirs. This isn't a random street crime. This is a calculated strike. They reach her just as she's unlocking the door to her Cadillac. No struggle. A quiet word. A hand on her elbow. The door to the sedan opens, she's guided inside, and the car pulls away from the curb. Just like that. The entire operation takes 12 seconds. Harlem keeps moving. Nobody saw a thing, or nobody who would talk. But Bumpy's network was always watching. The call came into his club, the Palm Cafe, within 3 minutes. A shaky voice from a payphone. They got Mamie. That's all. No details, no demands, just the one fact that could shatter the most powerful man in Harlem. Bumpy was in the back, playing chess. When they told him, his hand froze over the board. The king was in check. But this wasn't a game. This was a declaration of war on the one piece of his life that was supposed to be untouchable. They had crossed a line that even the 5 families knew not to cross. 20 minutes later, a young kid, a runner, rushed into the club. He was out of breath, holding a single folded piece of paper. He handed it to Bumpy's bodyguard, who passed it to the boss. Bumpy unfolded it. The message was typed, short, brutal. It gave a phone number, and it gave a deadline. You have 24 hours to comply. Do not call the police. We are watching. That was it. No signature, no specific demand, just a ticking clock. The chess game was forgotten. The room went cold. Bumpy Johnson, the man who never showed fear, looked at the faces around him, and for the first time, they saw it. Not fear. Something worse. A cold, focused rage that promised fire. Bumpy made the call from a secure line in the back office. The phone rang once and was picked up. The voice on the other end was calm, almost polite. It belonged to Vincent the accountant Marino, a rising strategist in the Genovese family. Marino laid it out. This was not about money. The ransom was Bumpy's complete and total surrender of Harlem. Every numbers bank, every policy operation, every slice of territory he had spent 30 years building and protecting. He was to hand over the ledgers, the names of his bankers, the locations of his drops. In exchange, they would release Mamie unharmed. The message was clear: your empire for your wife. It was a brilliant, arrogant move. The Genovese family had tried muscle. They had tried infiltration. They had even tried bribing his own people. Nothing worked. So Marino went for the heart. He assumed that Bumpy's love for Mamie was a vulnerability, a soft spot he could exploit. What he did not understand was that he was not poking a weak spot. He was kicking a hornet's nest. Bumpy listened to the terms without a word. When Marino finished, there was a long silence. Then Bumpy spoke, his voice low and steady. I need to speak to my wife. A moment later, Mamie's voice came on the line. Ellsworth? She said, using his real name. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the tension underneath. Are you hurt? he asked. "No," she said. "I'm okay." That was all he needed to know. "Sit tight, baby," he told her. "I'm coming." He hung up the phone. The men in the room watched him. They expected an explosion. They expected him to start throwing chairs, to start screaming orders. But that is not what happened. The initial shock was gone, replaced by an icy calm. The crime boss was gone. The enraged husband was gone. In his place was a military commander assessing a battlefield. His first order was simple: no negotiation. He wasn't going to give them a single street, a single dollar. Negotiation was a sign of weakness, and weakness got you killed. The second order was to activate the network. Every street spy, every police contact on the payroll, every bartender and barber who passed information. He needed eyes and ears. He needed to know where Marino was hiding, how many men he had, what his routines were. The third order was the most critical. He turned to his most trusted enforcer, a man named Samuel. "I want pressure applied. Every Genovese operation in the city, their card games, their trucking fronts, their warehouses. Hit them. Not to start a war, to create noise, to make them look inward." The plan was set. While the Genovese were looking for an answer at the bargaining table, Bumpy was preparing to burn the whole house down. Harlem itself became Bumpy's weapon. His intelligence network was a thing of legend, but now it operated at a level of efficiency that even his own men had never seen. It started with the barber shops. A dozen shops across Harlem served as communication hubs. A specific phrase said to a barber, "I need a trim, short on the sides," would trigger a chain reaction. A kid on a bicycle would be sent to a specific street corner. A woman hanging laundry on a rooftop would change the arrangement of her sheets, signaling a lookout. It was a silent, fluid language that the Mafia, for all its power, could never decipher. Rooftop lookouts were positioned with binoculars, watching for unfamiliar cars, for patterns of movement that didn't belong. Street-level spies, shoe-shine boys, newspaper vendors, reported anyone asking questions, anyone who looked out of place. The genius of it was the psychological warfare. While this massive machine whirred into action, Bumpy himself remained visibly calm. He was seen at his usual table at the Palm Cafe. He took a walk in the afternoon. He showed the world a face of utter control. He wanted Marino to hear that he wasn't panicking. He wanted to force the question, why isn't he afraid? What does he know that I don't? Simultaneously, the pressure on the Genovese operations began. A high-stakes poker game in the Bronx was raided not by police, but by a rival crew, tipping them off anonymously. A warehouse in Jersey holding imported goods suddenly caught fire. A truck carrying goods for a Genovese front company was hijacked, and the driver left tied up with a message, "This is for Mamie." The attacks were scattered, seemingly random, but their purpose was singular: to create chaos within the Genovese ranks, to make Marino's men nervous, to force mistakes. Bumpy was playing chess on a citywide board, and he was sacrificing pawns to expose the king. And then, the first break came. It didn't come from a street spy or a paid informant. It came from a low-level Genovese soldier named Angelo, who ran a small bookmaking operation in East Harlem. He had a wife and a new baby. He'd heard about the kidnapping. Taking a man's wife? That wasn't business. That was a curse. He knew where men who did that ended up. So he took a risk. He used a payphone miles from his usual spot and called a number he'd heard was a way to reach Bumpy. He didn't give his name. He just gave a location: an abandoned meatpacking warehouse on the West Side docks. They were there, he said. But they moved her. Look for the chalk. Then he hung up. The message was relayed to Bumpy. It was a thin thread. It could be a trap, but it was the only thread they had. The clock was ticking. 18 hours to go. Bumpy stood in the back office of the Palm Cafe, the anonymous tip hanging in the air. An abandoned meatpacking warehouse. A low-level soldier with a conscience. And a clue. Look for the chalk. His inner circle waited for his decision. Samuel, his enforcer, argued it was an obvious trap. They're laying bait, Bumpy. They know you're desperate. They want to draw you out into the open. The logic was sound. Vincent Marino was a strategist. He would anticipate a reckless move. But Bumpy saw the gambit differently. He saw the fear. A man with a new family, breaking ranks on something this big? That wasn't part of a plan. That was a crack in their foundation. A man who worries about a curse isn't laying a trap, Bumpy said, his voice low. He's trying to save his own soul. The risk was immense. If it was a trap, he'd be walking his best men into an ambush. But if it was real, it was the only lead they had. The clock was down to 18 hours. Indecision was a decision to fail. He made the call. They would go. But not with desperation. With overwhelming, precise force. He wouldn't send a small team to scout. He would send his entire enforcement squad to surround the location, to cut off every exit, to move with the quiet efficiency of a surgical strike. The order was simple: secure the perimeter, silence any resistance, find evidence. They weren't going there to rescue Mamie. Angelo had said she'd been moved. They were going there to tear the operation apart from the inside, to find the thread that would lead them to the next location. This was no longer a search. It was an interrogation of a building. The warehouse district was a graveyard of industry after dark. The meatpacking plant was a hulking silhouette against the night sky, its windows boarded up, the air around it thick with the ghostly smell of old blood and rust. Bumpy's men moved like shadows. 8 of them, hand-picked for their silence and their resolve. They didn't approach from the street. They came from the rooftops of adjacent buildings, crossing on narrow planks, dropping down into the fenced-in yard without a sound. 2 men took positions covering the main loading bays. 2 more covered the fire escapes. The remaining 4, led by Samuel, approached a side door that had been pried open and clumsily reclosed. Inside, the cavernous space was a maze of rusted conveyor belts and hanging meat hooks. The only light came from a single bulb hanging over a small cleared area in the center, where 2 men sat playing cards at a makeshift table. They were low-level muscle, bored and unprepared. They didn't hear the side door open. They didn't see the 4 figures fan out through the darkness. The takedown was swift and brutal. One guard was knocked unconscious with a sap to the back of the head before he could even stand. The other managed to get his hand on a pistol, but Samuel was on him, twisting the weapon away and driving a knee into his gut, silencing him with a gag. They searched the area. It was clearly a temporary holding site. There were food wrappers, empty bottles, and in the corner, a single chair with ropes lying next to it. But no Mamie. Then Samuel saw it, just as the informant had said. On the floor near the chair, almost invisible against the grimy concrete, was a small white mark. A chalk arrow pointing toward a metal staircase that led to a second-floor office. They followed it. The office was empty except for a desk and an overflowing ashtray. But on the desk was a half-finished ledger. Samuel flipped it open. It wasn't for bookmaking. It was a log. Entries for gasoline, for supplies, and one entry from that morning. Transferred to the Pines, 9:00 a.m. 2 cars. Samuel brought the ledger and one of the captured guards, now trembling and bleeding from a split lip, back to the Palm Cafe. Bumpy looked at the log entry. The Pines. It was a known location, a secluded, fortified estate owned by a Genovese associate upstate, used for meetings they didn't want anyone to see. This was the real location. The warehouse was just a way station. Bumpy's rage, which had been contained as cold focus, now threatened to boil over. They had moved her. They were keeping her isolated. He looked at the captured guard. "You drove her?" The man nodded, terrified. Bumpy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Was she hurt?" The guard shook his head vigorously. "No, sir. The accountant said she was to be treated with respect. Until the deadline." That single word, the accountant, confirmed it all. Vincent Marino. This was his elaborate, arrogant plan. A multi-layered shell game designed to exhaust Bumpy, to make him dance for 24 hours until he was broken and compliant. But Marino had made his fatal error. He had given Bumpy a target, and he had underestimated the speed and violence of the response. The cold fury returned, sharper than ever. The chessboard was clear. Now the king was in the open. The clock was ticking down to 12 hours. The final confrontation was taking shape, and it would happen at a place called the Pines. Vincent the accountant Marino was the architect of this entire crisis. He wasn't a street thug. He was a strategist, a numbers man who had risen through the Genovese family by being smarter, not tougher, than the competition. He saw the world in balance sheets and probabilities, and his calculation was simple. Bumpy Johnson's empire was an anomaly. A black man controlling a prime territory like Harlem was a glitch in the Mafia's system. They had tried force. It failed. They had tried money. It failed. Turning his own people had failed. So Marino went for the one variable that couldn't be quantified on a ledger: emotional attachment. His plan was a masterpiece of psychological pressure. The 24-hour deadline, the moving of Mamie from the warehouse to the fortified estate upstate, known as the Pines. It was all designed to exert maximum stress, to make Bumpy feel the clock ticking down, to corner him into a desperate, emotional decision. The Pines was perfect. Isolated, defensible. Owned by a shell corporation so distant from the Genovese name that it was practically untraceable. Marino believed he was playing multidimensional chess, while Bumpy was still playing checkers. He was sitting in a plush study at the Pines, confident that he was 3 moves ahead. He had men stationed not just at the estate, but on the access roads. He had a direct line to the family leadership. He was waiting for the call where a broken Bumpy Johnson would surrender his kingdom. What Marino didn't account for was that Bumpy didn't play by the rules of the balance sheet. Bumpy's calculus was older, simpler. It was the calculus of the street, of survival. When you are backed into a corner, you don't negotiate for more time. You break the walls down. Marino's overconfidence was his blind spot. He believed his intellect had insulated him from the raw, violent consequences of his actions. He thought because he was in a guarded house miles away, he was safe. He didn't understand that by touching Mamie, he had made it personal. And for Bumpy Johnson, personal problems had only one kind of solution. While Marino was reviewing his flawless plan, Bumpy was already dividing his forces, preparing to hit multiple Genovese operations as a distraction, while his core team prepared to breach the one place Marino thought was impenetrable. As the final hours bled away, Harlem held its breath. The tension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air. Then, precisely as the 24-hour deadline arrived, all hell broke loose across the city. It wasn't a single event. It was a coordinated symphony of chaos orchestrated by Bumpy. A Genovese-owned social club in Little Italy was firebombed, sending patrons scrambling into the street. A truck carrying a fortune in untaxed cigarettes was hijacked at a stoplight, the drivers left stunned on the curb. A high-stakes dice game involving several made men was violently interrupted by a crew claiming a rival family had sent them. The attacks were simultaneous, widespread, and confusing. The Genovese command structure, already nervous from the earlier pressure, went into panic mode. Phones rang off the hook. Orders were shouted. The family's attention was pulled in a dozen different directions at once. It was the perfect distraction. While the Genovese were putting out fires across New York, two black sedans moved like ghosts along the back roads leading to the Pines. Inside one car, Bumpy sat in the passenger seat, his face a mask of grim determination. Samuel drove. They didn't speak. The plan was set. They knew the estate had a perimeter of 4 men. They knew Marino was inside with 2 personal bodyguards, and they knew Mamie was being held in a second-floor bedroom. As the cars stopped a quarter-mile from the gate, Bumpy's team moved on foot through the woods, surrounding the property with a silence that was more frightening than any noise. The breach was swift and brutal. The perimeter guards were taken down with silenced pistols before they could raise an alarm. The front door was blown open with a small charge. The 2 bodyguards in the foyer barely had time to reach for their weapons before they were cut down. Bumpy moved through the house with a terrifying purpose, Samuel at his side. They cleared the first floor, then moved up the grand staircase. They found Marino in the study, just as they expected. He was standing behind his desk, a pistol in his hand, but his face was pale with shock. The plan, his beautiful, logical plan, had collapsed in a matter of minutes. Bumpy didn't even look at the gun. He looked Marino dead in the eyes. "Where is she?" Marino, realizing he was utterly defeated, gestured weakly toward a hallway. "Second door on the left." Samuel moved to secure the hallway as Bumpy stepped closer to the desk. Marino started to speak, to try and bargain, to explain it was just business. Bumpy didn't let him finish. The confrontation was not a negotiation. It was a sentencing. Meanwhile, Samuel found the bedroom door locked. He kicked it open. Mamie was inside, sitting in a chair by the window. She was unharmed, her composure intact, though the fear in her eyes was clear. When she saw Samuel, then Bumpy appearing in the doorway behind him, the fear vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, relief. She had played her own part, staying calm, gathering what information she could, waiting for the moment she knew would come. The violent resolution inside the estate was total. Marino and his remaining men were not left alive to report the failure. The message Bumpy intended to send required no witnesses to contradict it. As they led Mamie out of the house and back to the cars, the night was silent again. The distant chaos in the city was already subsiding. The 24-hour ultimatum had expired, but not with Bumpy's surrender. It had expired with the absolute and final demonstration of what happened when you mistook a man's love for a weakness. The war was over almost as soon as it had begun, and the legend of Bumpy Johnson had just been forged in the hottest fire imaginable. The bodies were returned to the Genovese family with no note, no explanation. The message was, the bodies themselves. The stunned silence from the 5 families was louder than any declaration of war. They tested the one rule everyone understood: you don't touch a man's family, and the response was absolute, surgical, and final. In Harlem, the story spread not as a tale of violence, but as a legend of protection. Respect for Bumpy wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about an unshakable code. He wasn't just a crime boss. He was Harlem's shield. For Mamie, the ordeal solidified a grim reality she already knew. Her life was inextricably linked to a man who lived by a different set of rules. But it also confirmed his promise. No matter the cost, he would always come for her. The dynamic with the Mafia shifted permanently. There were no more territorial challenges, no more attempts at intimidation. A new, unspoken agreement was forged in the ashes of Marino's failed gambit. They would do business, but there was a line, and everyone now knew its exact location. This single day became the cornerstone of the Bumpy Johnson myth. It defined his later years, transforming him from a powerful gangster into an untouchable folk hero. The respect he earned echoed in unlikely places. Even his rivals acknowledged the sheer strategic brilliance of his response. The myth, of course, grew larger than the reality. Some stories say he took down a dozen men single-handedly. Others claim he made Marino beg. But the reality was more powerful. It was the story of a man who turned his greatest perceived vulnerability into his ultimate demonstration of strength. Official histories, written by outsiders, often omit this event. It doesn't fit the narrative they want to tell. But in Harlem, the story was passed down, a quiet lesson in power and the fatal error of underestimating a man's love. It proved that some lines, once crossed, can only be drawn again in blood. The single takeaway is this: underestimating the lengths a man will go to for what he loves is a strategic error you only make once. This is the story history tried to bury. If you want more legends they don't want you to know, subscribe right now. The price for crossing Bumpy Johnson was always the same, and it was always final.